Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 8, our final week of Great Decisions 2022. We have an absolutely amazing lecture coming up for you this evening. I've had a chance to work with Dr. Phillips a little bit at looking at the PowerPoint for tonight, and it's going to be an absolutely incredible lecture presentation. Before we get going, I just wanted to, for the last time this year, thank our series sponsors, because without them, we wouldn't be able to present this whole 8-week series in its entirety and have such fantastic expert speakers on the topics as Dr. Phillips. So I would like to thank our sponsors one last time for this year. And so thank you very much to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So a huge, huge thank you to our sponsors. However, I would like to bring up that you can get this pamphlet that I'm holding up right now at the following URL, which is going to appear on screen right now. And right there, that is our webpage for the Great Decisions Lecture Series. With this pamphlet that you can download, inside it has a form for donating to the Great Decisions Legacy Fund. Now, as much as we love our sponsors, and make no mistake, we love them, we would love if one day we could make this a completely self-sustaining effort so that we, our sponsors would be able to help out with other library programs, for example. Not that we don't love them, but if we could become self-sustaining, that would be absolutely phenomenal. So the URL you see on your screen, www.manitowoclibrary.org/events/great-decisions, is where you would head to be able to get that pamphlet with that information. Also, while I have you here, I thought I would bring up that probably for the next 2 remaining weeks, we will have the Great Decisions companion piece available at the library. And thanks to the underwriting of our Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, this great companion publication is available for $15, cash or check only, but it gives such a good basis and such good resources on all the topics that we're presenting. So if you're interested, these are available at the main service desk for $15. But you didn't come here tonight to listen to me talking about everything that isn't outer space. So before I turn the microphone and the camera over to Dr. Phillips, I would like to introduce you to him. So Ken Phillips has served as curator. One second. I'm going to actually let you get a better look at Dr. Phillips, because you all pretty much know what I look like. But Ken Phillips has served as curator for aerospace science at the California Science Center since 1990 and is responsible for the vision that shapes the exhibits and programs in aeronautics and space exploration, including the future 200,000 square foot Samuel Oshin Air and Space Center with groundbreaking scheduled for June 2022. He serves as principal contact with the Smithsonian Institution, NASA, and the United States Air Force Museum for the acquisition and conservation of artifacts from the National Collection. In 1990, Ken envisioned the display of a flown space shuttle orbiter, and in 2009, authored the proposal that resulted in NASA's award of Space Shuttle Endeavour to California and the Science Center in 2011. The new Samuel Oshin Air and Space Center will feature Endeavour in launch position, along with 100 other major artifacts and nearly 150 interactive exhibits in the fields of aeronautics and space exploration. Ken is also an adjunct professor of the practice of physics and astronomy in the Dorrance Life College of Letter Arts and Sciences at the University of Southern California, where he teaches the freshman seminar entitled The Space Shuttle and Our Place in the Universe. Ken also teaches an introductory astronomy course to in-custody students at the Santa Fe Springs Women's Correctional Facility as part of the USC Prison Education Program. He also teaches middle school courses on living and working in space in the California Science Center's hands-on science workshops, along with courses in astrophysics and planetary geology to high school girls from the New Village Girls Academy. Ken also taught aerospace engineering to middle school students in the Saturday Excel Academy, an enrichment program created by the Los Angeles Council of Black Professional Engineers. Ken has served on the board of directors of several organizations involved in education and the arts, including the National Board of the United States Academic Decathlon, the Watts Towers Art Center, Donna Sternberg and Dancers, and the Center for Advanced Learning Charter School at the Bilal Islamic Center. He has also served as a construction laborer building houses in rural Baja, Mexico with Corazon, a non-governmental organization supported in part by volunteers from St. Augustine by the Sea Episcopal Church in Santa Monica, California. Before joining the California Science Center, Ken was a member of the Engineering and Applied Science Department at the RAND Corporation for 14 years, involved in both domestic and national security research. Ken received his BS in physics from North Carolina A&T State University, an MS in general engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his PhD in environmental engineering from Johns Hopkins University. And I also had the pleasure of meeting Ken in person approximately 20 years at a couple of brunches at a mutual friends of our house. Yeah. And I couldn't believe when I contacted him out of the blue after 20 years that he agreed to do this. So as Rob Reiner said in Spinal Tap, enough of my yakking. Let me turn this over to Dr. Phillips as he gives you the lecture on outer space for this evening. And I'm going to take myself completely out of the picture and get his PowerPoint up and running. Dr. Phillips.
Oh, thank you so much, Tim. It's great to be here. I couldn't turn you down. You've been a friend for so many years, and this was an opportunity to get to know Manitowoc Public Library better. That's right. And also to learn a little bit more about the Foreign Policy Association, about which I knew very little, quite frankly. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to offer you a special thanks, Tim, for helping me get the lecture set up and all the technical coordination that goes on your end, and for putting up with my always last-minute tendency to get you the materials that you need. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It was my pleasure. It's just so wonderful to have you here.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do, I am assuming, I spoke with Tim earlier in this process, and he said that many of those who had joined us today would probably have read the article. It's actually quite a good article that Eric Berger wrote. He authored this for this. It's in that Great Decisions 22 edition of their journal, 2022 edition that he just showed you. And it's really quite a good article. And it's entitled Outer Space Policy, which is why I fashioned my talk directly after what Berger had said. He raises some really interesting questions in his dialogue there. And his narrative basically focuses on human space exploration. And when I say human space exploration, all of our exploration is conducted by humans, but one part of it involves putting people in rocket ships and blasting them out of the Earth's atmosphere to wherever you have them go, whether it's a low Earth orbit, whether it's to the moon or ultimately to Mars, it doesn't matter. The point is the human space flight aspect of our nation's effort to understand the universe, understand where it came from, is the thing that Berger chose to focus on. So I'm going to begin right there, and I'm going to make an argument that Berger's argument, his narrative rather, while important, is just a point of departure. And I'm going to argue that we need to broaden our conversation on what it means to think about the policy implications of international cooperation in space. So those are the marching orders, and I think if I could have the next slide, Tim, I'll give you the outline of how I think we can go about this. So I know we have a very broad audience here. People come from a large variety of backgrounds and academic trainings, and probably different age groups as well. So I'm going to give you a little history of where we've been when it comes to space exploration, and I'm going to start with humans in space. I'll say just a little bit on the scientific aspects. I'll show you what we've learned and share with you some of what we hope to learn I will then set the context for what I'm going to argue should be the bigger picture for our conversation. And at the end of it, I'm going to suggest some things called policy considerations. And this is a really 50,000 foot level at some of the key considerations that I think should be part of a protracted policy conversation. They're not policy recommendations themselves, but they are considerations that I think any learned or thoughtful body of people or collections of bodies of people, and they can take place in all walks of life, should be involved with when we're having this decision about what does international cooperation look like, where does it benefit us, where does it hurt us, where are the risks, as we move forward with what I'm going to argue again is a broader conversation that I'd like to argue for. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with human exploration, and that begins, oddly enough, or at least it is an outgrowth of, the next slide, war. Now, war is an interesting thing. They continue to break out and have for all of human history. And we know, given what's going on in Ukraine right now, that they are tragic. And out of them come destruction. People lose their lives. You wonder sometime when wars begin, why people don't conclude, at some point this is going to end. Why don't we jump to the negotiations now and just do away with the killing? We'll take that killing part out of it, and we'll go to the negotiations that are ultimately, at some point, going to bring the war to a stop. We don't tend to do that. I think what's going on right now in the Ukraine is a clear indication of how we have yet again gone astray. But having said that, I don't want to paint a picture where there is no hope, because I think there's a great deal of hope for us going forward, and I'll share a few thoughts about that in a minute. Next slide. So this slide actually shows what happened at the end of World War II. World War II, 1939 to 1945. It basically changed the way we thought about ourselves as humans. It changed our relationships. It created technologies with which we're still grappling today, and it set the stage in 1945, and I'll show you that slide in a minute, for some of the things that are the seeds for what you see in the Ukraine right now. It also was the birth, as an aftermath, of the American space program, and it basically launched a race between the United States and the former Soviet Union that has produced both its challenges and its opportunities. Next slide, please. This is a world divided. And this is the thing that we've contended with as countries, separate nations, formerly the Warsaw Pact and NATO alliances, and of course, independent countries there, for the last almost 80 years. You look, there's toward the central part of that graph, there is clearly a blue delineation from, say, Sweden westward. Turkey is an exception. It's about as far east as the NATO alliance had managed to involve itself. And of course, everything else that is red was the former Soviet socialist republics, and of course, the allied nations, including Yugoslavia, and others that were affiliated with that communist realm. The 15 Soviet socialist republics, as you know, broke themselves apart. It was a shock when it happened. It changed the world, at least marginally. A lot of what we're seeing right now in terms of the Ukraine's involvement with Russia goes back to this delineation. It has haunted us and will continue to do so. We all hope this war will resolve itself as quickly as it possibly can, but that remains to be seen. And so it's in the context of this ongoing conflict, which is quite ironic, that I find myself giving this talk. When I spoke with Tim, I guess it was originally as early as September or October, as he was aligning these various talks for the Foreign Policy Association, that war had not started. Perhaps others knew that it was pending and perhaps unavoidable. I myself did not. And so I kind of wrote this lecture initially with one set of thoughts in mind, and then of course I changed it as current events have progressed. So this is the world that wound up as a very divided entity. And if you look at that graph, you'll see a green line on the bottom, and some red dots are going to show up as I progress through the talk. And those red dots are just to show you how a series of major events began to cluster along the way as time went on. And those major events at certain times clustered very tightly, and at other times there was a fair amount of green space between the clustering of the dots. And you'll see what this built up to in terms of a pressure cooker type of analogy, and then led to the space race that I'm going to tell you about, and then to the opportunities that I'm going to argue are in front of us. So next slide, please. So the world divided basically ended with 1945, the United States having been the first and so far only country to ever detonate a nuclear weapon in anger. That had not happened before and has not happened since. Both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as you know, in 1945, brought the war to the end. Wasn't very many years later, 1949, where we realized that Russia also had atomic bomb capability. They understood the atom. They understood how to corral the energy of an atom, control it to the point where you had nuclear detonation, that detonation, weapons of mass destruction. And then between the United States and the former Soviet Union, particularly regarding United States policy, there were a number of doctrines that were issued. They were basically, at least initially, around a doctrine of mutually assured destruction, meaning that any entity that would strike another entity in anger would receive like in kind. And so that was a deterrent nation, and it set nuclear weapons apart, not as fighting weapons, but as political weapons. And that is so far what they have remained to this day. Now, bringing us back to the current for just a second, the issue of what may be of concern, which is going on in Ukraine right now, is nuclear weapons are no longer as massive and as cumbersome as they once were. And they're working themselves down to a point where they could have tactical or battlefield capability, which they did not have before. They were primarily strategic weapons designed initially, but not ultimately, toward population centers. As these doctrines began to evolve and people recognized that the population centers could be destroyed and leave an aggressor vulnerable to a counterattack, those doctrines modified themselves and became initially geared toward the attack of military forces. The idea being that if I'm going to go first, then I want to take out my adversary's ability to retaliate, so that I will draw down his retaliatory capability as much as I could, and I wouldn't be hit back with the full force of what he could otherwise do. That was the logic behind it. This was basically the governing structure that kept the world, some would argue, stable for the last 80 years, or since 1945, actually, when these weapons first became available, and 1949, when we found out that the Russians did indeed have that capability. Next slide, please. So what we see here is, in the aftermath of this capability that we now know Russia has from a military perspective, they also leaped ahead of us in terms of their technological capability. Now, October 4th, 1957, 64th anniversary of that is coming up this year, is when Sputnik was launched. It was a very small thing. It's about a meter in diameter. It isn't very heavy at all. And it was launched by the Russians, and it actually caught us by surprise. And it caught us by surprise for two reasons. We had been working, having had the benefit of the von Karman military group in Peenemünde in Germany, to build a space program here in the United States. And it was very fledgling at first. You may remember that 1957 was an international geophysical year. That was a year in which the United States and other countries began to look toward technological capabilities. Well, Sputnik flew in 1957, and it was indeed a Russian scare, as the slide suggests. And it was a Russian scare, next slide, please, not because of the nature of the payload itself, but because of what it implied. It implied that any organization, any country that could loft a weapon from its homeland and put it into orbit could loft a peaceful object like Sputnik. And it was an atmosphere sensor, an upper atmosphere sensor. It was data collector and stuff like that. So there were no weapons on it. There was nothing lethal or at all nefarious about it. But what it implied had to do more with the rocketry and the propulsion capability than anything else. It simply said that one could deliver a weapon from any point on Earth to any other point on Earth. And that was problematic because that meant that independent of the payload, whether it was peaceful or not, it could be directed anywhere anyone who had that capability chose to direct it. And therein lies the problem. Next slide. And so the American response to that was a dismal failure. In fact, I remember having seen this when I was a kid. The rocket that you see is a Vanguard, and it literally lifted itself from the launch platform. It went up about 8 feet, maybe not so much, maybe a little bit higher than that, but not much. And then it very slowly and somewhat dramatically just fell back down into the fireball that you were seeing. It didn't destroy itself in a magnificent fireball. It just consumed itself. And it was basically a 3-pound payload. And the rocket exploded, and then jokingly it was named Kaputnik. Okay. At that time, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NASA had not been formed, began to assess U.S. capability, launch capability more thoroughly in 1958. Next slide. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which was the successor to NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, had a successful response with the spacecraft that you see there, which is called Explorer 1. Explorer 1 flew on a Juno rocket. It did have orbital capability, meaning that it had enough energy to go into orbit around the Earth, which is different than, let's say, kicking a soccer ball, letting it go up through the atmosphere, follows a parabolic trajectory, and then it comes back down. That's called a suborbital trajectory. Well, this had the ability to reach orbit, didn't weigh much, it's about 30 pounds, and it had scientific instruments on it. It was actually the instrument that verified the location of what are now known as the Van Allen radiation belts. So we know where these radiation belts are most prominent around the Earth, and we know how to avoid them when we have humans on spacecraft. So this was America's success through January 31st in 1958. This happened. Okay, the year in which NASA was born. Next, please. So following that, there were a series of embarrassments that all added to an increasing set of tensions between the former Soviet Union and the United States. One of which had to do with this U-2 incident, which happened in May of 1960. Francis Garris-Paros was flying a U-2 aircraft, about 80,000 feet was its capability, and it was shot down over Russian territory. And that was not a good day because it indicated that the United States had been spying on Russia, had violated their sovereign airspace. And of course, President Eisenhower, understandably, trying to come up with an argument for plausible denial, indicated that it was not a spy plane, that it had not been developed secretly, which it had. It was a CIA-operated bird. And then he did what he could to avoid a very embarrassing situation getting even worse, unsuccessfully, I might add. Next slide, please. And so what happens then, on top of that, we have a change in election. So the policies begin to shift. Eisenhower is succeeded by President Kennedy, who ran against Nixon, if you remember. This was 1960. I remember it very well because I had to play, when I was in the 6th grade, John Kennedy, and I had to come up with an acceptance speech. And this was after the fact, we knew he'd won. So that was our role play that year. And I was very proud to play John Kennedy. I wasn't sure whether I was happy that he won or not. I was in the 6th grade. I was probably about 11 years old, and I didn't have much in the way of political savvy at the time, but it was fun to play John Kennedy. So I always sort of go back to that. I remember it whenever I give a talk like this. Okay, next. So we've got new leadership there. And then not long after Kennedy is in office, several things happen. Number one, the Bay of Pigs. Well, there's a very controversial and unsuccessful effort to liberate people from Cuba. The Castro regime was a thorn in the side of the Kennedy administration. It was an aggression against that country. It turned out, quite frankly, to be a betrayal. The decision to proceed was in 1961. This was something that Kennedy inherited from Eisenhower. 1,500 Cuban exiles were to lead an invasion. U.S. air support was promised, but that air support did not materialize. And so it was a dismal failure in April 17th of 1961. Next slide, please. And you'll notice that all of these things are a series of, let's say, domino embarrassments, if you will, to the West, because of things that we had done mistakenly, and because of things that that in Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well were developing under their own momentum. The construction of the Berlin Wall, I think, probably caught everybody on Earth by surprise. It went up amazingly quickly, and it began to be a more sophisticated structure as time went on. It divided Berlin into a communist East and a non-communist West Berlin. Notice that the number of red dots that are appearing just beneath there where you see the kid along that green strip are increasing. So there's this series of increasing embarrassments. And where I'm going with this lecture is I'm trying to get you to say, as I give this narrative, that, oh my gosh, things are really, really getting bad, and they're getting bad at an increasing rate. Because there's a punchline at the end of this that I think you might find a little surprising. Next slide, please. So in addition to the Berlin Wall, we've got Russian missiles in Cuba. Okay, so just add that to the things that are happening. So these cartoons represent just kind of the tenacity of the arguments that were taking place between the West and the East. We had Khrushchev, who was a tried and true politician from Russia, who was up against this new American president. I think Khrushchev badly misjudged the character of Kennedy, misjudged his resolve, took his what appeared to be relatively liberal attitudes for the time mistakenly. Kennedy was arguably a hawk. He was not someone who was likely to back down from a competition, although or from a confrontation if one was brought to his door. He certainly was not one who would initiate one, but decided to respond in a very particular and deliberate way to Khrushchev's placement of missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the shore from Florida. It's quite close to us. Next slide, please. And what he did was order a blockade. Now, that's an act of war. And that could have been an act that defined the end of civilization as we know it at that time. Two things prevented that from happening. Number one, Khrushchev backed down. And I was a very happy little kid when that happened. I remember it. And number two, there probably weren't enough fissile material or nuclear material, fusion material on either side to have really sustained a war. We could have had huge amounts of destruction. But there was a missile gap because there was the perception on our part primarily that the former Soviet Union had a great deal more in its arsenals than it actually had. And that had a psychological implication because it meant that we were likely to make decisions in error based upon what we thought that they could do. I think probably Kennedy has to go down as one of the most skillful statesmen of all time, given the way he negotiated and was so carefully adept, really, really light on his feet in getting us through this very, very stressful period. October of 1962, lots of red dots clustering all at that one point in history. Next slide, please. There comes a national challenge. This is Rice University's graduation in 1962. In the aftermath of everything that had happened, Kennedy, giving hope to the nation, lays out a list of major challenges. They're all technologically difficult challenges. And he says one of the things that is going to happen, or that he would like to happen, is that America, by the end of the decade, okay, that means essentially 8 years from the time this speech was given, would land a person on the moon and return them safely to Earth. And at the time that speech was made, America had one or two successful flights. It was a suborbital flight in which Alan Shepard had flown. It's the first human in space. And that flight was barely successful and barely had enough capability to get a human being in about a 2,500-pound space capsule lofted above the atmosphere on a parabolic or up and down trajectory or suborbital trajectory and land him in the ocean. And at that point, with Jerome Wiesner then being his science advisor, their advisors put their heads together and they convinced the president that he should go public with this announcement. And people were scratching their heads wondering, how could this possibly happen, given the distance between that initial Alan Shepard suborbital flight and what would be implied by a successful mission to the lunar surface. It was almost an unthinkable, crazy thing to do. But next slide. It initiated 3 programs, and they were sequential programs. First was Project Mercury, second was Project Gemini, and third was Project Apollo. And I can remember when I was a kid, I'd see these space flights and they'd launch and they were so dramatic, but I never understood that there was a method to the madness. I didn't understand that they were trying to sort of figure out certain things and develop certain capabilities before moving on to the next step. And I'll share those with you now. We'll start with Project Mercury. Project Mercury had one simple objective, and that was mainly to see if humans could function cognitively in space, because we hadn't been there before. Would it be possible to think clearly? Could you maintain manual dexterity? Would you become disoriented to the point that you couldn't be functional? Well, no one knew. We hadn't done it. And so the objectives were to place a spacecraft in a stable low Earth orbit, investigate the human ability to function, and then recover that human and the spacecraft safely. There were 3 suborbital, again, parabolic missions, followed by 5 orbital missions to sort that problem out. And the little guy that you see in the picture there, the little guy on the right, is Ham. He was a chimpanzee. HAM is an acronym. It stands for Holloman Aeromedical, which is the laboratory in which the chimpanzee colony, Ham was a 4-year-old chimpanzee who was obtained from the Cameroon. And he and his colleagues, his chimpanzee colleagues, were trained to do repetitive tasks. They're very mischievous animals, but they're extremely smart. And what they did to determine this capability before sending Alan Shepard and other humans was they had experiments in which the chimpanzees would observe a series of flashing lights. And in response to the pattern of lights, they would pull levers in their spacecraft. And every time they got correct pulling of the lever, they got a little banana pellet reward. And anytime they did it incorrectly, they got a very mild electric shock just to tingle their toes on their feet, just to indicate that they'd done it wrong. And it turns out that the chimpanzees were far superior to the astronauts in doing this, and they could do as high as 7,500 repeated correct decisions. They were incredibly good at this, and they were good stand-ins for humans because of their skeletal structure as well. And they were sort of the first to go into space for us to determine whether or not it would be safe to send humans and have them do more complex tasks. And I mentioned Project Mercury because the Science Center is very fortunate to have the very Mercury spacecraft that Ham flew in back in 1961. Next slide, please. So the Gemini program was a program between this ability to determine whether humans could be cognitively savvy and sound in space and the Apollo actual landings. And here's the reason it had to be introduced. There are a number of ways you could go onto the moon and back. And you can imagine yourself taking a rocket fully fueled, landing it on the surface of the moon, getting out, doing whatever exploration one would have to do, getting back into that fully fuel-laden rocket and coming back to Earth. But the problem is it's extraordinarily inefficient and difficult to do. And so the decision was made, largely argued by an engineer, John Houbolt was his name, to take that mission and break it into components. So first you go into low Earth orbit, which means you blast off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You stabilize in low Earth orbit, make sure all of your systems are okay. And once you've checked those out, you add speed to your spacecraft to leave low Earth orbit and go to the moon. So once you're in the moon, instead of landing the entire spacecraft, you break the spaceship apart. You put a mothership in orbit around the moon, and you put an exploration vehicle, separate it from the mothership, go down to the lunar surface, do what you ever had to do, whatever you wanted to do. Then you leave as much of that exploration vehicle on the lunar surface as you can, so you don't have to lift its weight off. And you come back in a lunar ascent vehicle, at which point you have to find the mother vehicle that you left in lunar orbit. And that's called the rendezvous and docking problem. And that was a problem that was most directly addressed and solved by astronaut Buzz Aldrin. A lot of people think of Buzz, who I'm honored to know. I actually don't know him fairly well. I've known him for a long time, just as a result of my work with him at the California Science Center, as an astronaut who is somewhat a celebrity, but he is an incredible engineer. He was a brilliant mathematician, studied at MIT, and he was the one who was able to take the complex equations of rendezvous and docking and turn them into a set of algorithms that astronauts and computers could follow to make this problem go away. And he did that brilliantly. And so you had the rendezvous and docking problem solved, and that was the purpose of Project Gemini. How do we maintain authority and control over our spacecraft? What does it look like to be in complete control of those things that we send into space? And so there were multiple flights, as there always are in this program. There were 10 orbital flights. There were 5 EVAs. EVA means an extra vehicle activity, for those of you who might not be familiar with that. 2 of those flights were actual rendezvous, and then 5 of the flights were docking. A rendezvous is when you become safely in proximity to another vehicle, but you don't dock with it. And of course, the docking is when you link the vehicles together. And the thing about the rendezvous and docking process is not only does it have to become something where you can find the vehicle, but all of spaceflight, absolutely all of it, has to do with speed and changes in speed. And it's how fast you're going, the direction that you're going in it, and the time that you have to be at the place you need to be. So when we're launching for the moon, we don't launch in the direction where the moon happens to be at that time. We anticipate the movement of the moon through its trajectory around the Earth, and then we launch to the point where we know the moon will be, and it takes 3 days to get there. And so we just plot ahead, we count the angular degrees that the moon moves every day, and then we count that multiplied times 3 days, 3.5 days. That's how long it takes to get there. And that's how we direct our rockets to intersect things that we need to intersect. And that has to do with whether we're doing robotic probes and we're reaching planets such as Jupiter and Neptune and Uranus and all those things out in the outer solar system, or whether we're trying to get to Mars or to the moon. It does not matter. It's all about speed and changes in speed. That's all of spaceflight. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, we come to the point where we're ready to put humans on the surface of the Earth. And it was an amazing, I mean, really nail-biting set of a period of time in the 1960s, during which we're landing humans on the surface of the moon and returning them safely. There were 2 Earth orbital tests, just to make sure we could control the hardware. There were 2 lunar orbit tests in which we went to the moon. We didn't land, but we orbited and came back. One of those took place in 1968. And it was right around the time of the Democratic National Convention, which really was quite problematic and really traumatic the way that went. It was in Chicago that year, if I remembered correctly. And there was a very well-known note of congratulations and thanks to the Apollo astronauts for giving us something that was hopeful and very forward-looking in that very troubled time. The lunar orbital tests were then followed by 6 successful landings, and there was 1 abort, which was made into a wonderful motion picture starring Tom Hanks, which is called Apollo 13. Okay, so we have these flights here, and we've got these 3 successive programs that lead us from the early days of barely being able to lift off the surface of the Earth and return in one piece to a trip to the moon and back. And we did that multiple times. And as we did it, we got more sophisticated each time. We brought more lunar samples back each time. In the latter lunar flights, numbers 15, 16, and 17, we actually had the ability to put a little rover on the moon. This looks like a beach buggy, and we could drive around the moon and explore more of the lunar surface. Okay, all of this background, next slide. Next slide. Okay. And then what happens is there is a war of proxy in Vietnam. So again, that war of proxy is a war that is taking place essentially between communist forces and forces of democracies. And it was a very Washingtonian guided war because it was important that Soviet and American forces never come into direct contact. Because if they came into direct contact, go all the way back to 1945 and 1949, it could lead to an escalation of that conflict to a nuclear exchange. And we don't want that at any cost. And you can look at the time frame there, it's 14 years. The first starting with the French and then the United States taking over from that period from 1961 to 1975, when the Vietnam War abruptly ended. Okay, so this is the context, the political context in which the next set of things are going to take place. Okay, next slide, please. You know, all of this stuff that had happened before, and suddenly you have an opportunity rather, for the politics of cooperation. Well, where does that come from? I mean, you had nothing but conflict, much of it just short of war. And then out of that comes an opportunity for cooperation. Next slide, please. And it is a most unlikely opportunity, which actually started with conversations between scientists. Scientists have generally worked together very well. They meet each other at their international conferences. They're interested in the world that they're exploring. They have lots to share. They argue things out in the journals. They publish. They know each other. But that was all at a lower level of cooperation and potential collaboration. It got serious when the formal organizations, NASA and the Soviet Academy in Russia, next slide please, or just one click if you will, and these unlikely characters decided that they could push this forward and actually make this happen. This was Nixon, Kosygin, and Brezhnev. Very unlikely characters given the temperaments, if you've understood or if you've had a chance to read anything about these men, that this would happen, but indeed it did. And there were societal pressures for which it could happen. And there has to be a relief valve. There has to be something that gives people an incentive or something to hang their hat on so that a project like this can go meaningfully forward. There has to be something that makes people support it. Next slide. And it just so happens that there was a mission objective that was very noble in its character. First of all, recognizing détente, developing a meaningful and functional rescue capability so that American astronauts could rescue Soviet cosmonauts should they need to do so in space and vice versa, and also to establish the first meaningful national level cooperation between the two countries. And the book that's there on the left, it is to this day still a Bible. I highly recommend it. If you have a chance, read that book. It's a wonderful book. It's by Ed and Lynn Ezel. And it's a book called The Partnership. And it looks not so much at the technical aspects of the partnership, although that is interesting, but it looks at the politics before, during, and then after the collaboration. And it explains in wonderful detail, it's a great read, just how we became collaborative at a point at which we were so competitive prior. It explains how we went and solved the problems that allowed two countries who were very different in how they do things to collaborate. And of course, the aftermath of that collaboration. Next slide, please. And basically what happened is this. You have two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. They have different vehicles. We have an Apollo and they had a Soyuz. The crew sizes were different, but that didn't really matter. The launch latitudes were different. That does matter, because it's very hard to make sure that you are approaching a fast-moving vehicle at the right angle and at the right speed. The launch sites were different. Of course, they would be. Ours was the Kennedy Space Center. Theirs was Baikonur Cosmodrome. The launch latitudes obviously reflect those launch centers. And there were some technical problems. One click, please. And that has to do with the atmosphere and the gaseous compositions in the vehicles. The Russians used a full atmosphere, pretty much what you and I are breathing now, 20% oxygen and 80% nitrogen, but we used 1/3 atmosphere, which is 100% oxygen. And you can do that for relatively short durations without long-term chronic damage to the human body. The reason you can do that, or the reason we chose that design, is because by flying with 1/3 of an atmospheric pressure, the structure of the thing you're lifting into space can be lighter, and weight is always a penalty when it comes to spaceflight. And so that was a design strategy that made a great deal of sense. We actually got burned for it a little later. I won't talk about that, but it was a great tragedy, the Apollo fire that took place in 1968. But by and large, it was a reasonable approach to spaceflight, given what spaceflight implies. And then finally, astronaut control. We typically had astronauts that were fighter pilots. In fact, all of the men in the early space program, and they were all men, were test pilots. And they were people who were primarily interested in the control of very fast-moving vehicles. The Soviet Union has always, and even to this day, gone more toward the design of automated systems. Next slide. So what happens is, how do you get two countries that are completely different in their thinking to cooperate? What do? You can't expect within a reasonable a period of negotiating that either of them are going to give up the way they have done things traditionally for years. That isn't going to happen. And so you break the problem into components, and then you figure out which of the components you can solve and how you do it. And so the problem of the language differences, which were significantly, was, or the desired capability was a language fluency. And then we solved that problem by assuring that the astronauts and cosmonauts trained in each other's country. And it worked. The operating philosophies were the were the real problems, and they were so problematic that what we decided to do, and this was brilliant, was to focus, instead of changing each person's method of doing business, we created a docking module that went between these two very differently designed capsules. And once we created that docking module, we could adjust the pressures, making the Soviets come down a third of an atmosphere and us going up a third of an atmosphere. So we met at 10 psi. And then we adjust the atmospheric compositions just by introducing nitrogen when we're docking and by purging nitrogen on departure. And so what we basically did was created a really tightly defined engineering project. It had a clear set of design characteristics. It had a clean beginning, a clean ending, and the way in which it was executed was a mission. Next slide. It proved its point here with this crew. The two that you see in green, Valery Kobasid and Alexei Leonov, and of course the three on the left were Tom Stafford and Mattingly, and also, not Mattingly, it was Deke Slayton, who was on the left, one of the original Mercury astronauts, and the gentleman in the middle who was actually the one who was the pilot of the vehicle. So Tom Slayton had controlled, or was the commander of the vehicle. Next slide, please. And you'll notice that the upper left shows the docking. If you look very carefully, the American vehicle, which is the Apollo, is on the right, and the Soviet Soyuz is on the left, and that trapezoidal-looking device in the middle was the docking device. So next slide. So what we did was basically solve this problem by creating, and there's the engineering drawing, a mechanical technical solution that allowed two countries who think and perform in very different ways to collaborate. And it was a brilliant solution. It was a brilliant solution. Next slide. This is the legacy of the Apollo-Soyuz cooperation. The Mir space station, Mir is a Russian word for peace, docked with the United States space shuttles on a number of occasions. And those dockings allowed us to collaborate with the Russians in a broadened capacity. We learned how large space structures flex in space. We learned from the Soviet experience. We had a total of 7 space shuttle dockings with the Mir, 7 by the Space Shuttle Atlantis, 1 by Discovery, and 1 by Endeavour. Next slide. And you'll notice that it is also to this day that we're enjoying the results of that collaboration, because the International Space Station, again, we learned what it meant to dock with large structures. We learned from that Soviet experience, and there have been 59 Soyuz dockings, that's the Russian vehicle, and 37 space shuttle dockings at the International Space Station. Okay, next slide. Here's the first of several observations I want to share with you, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I think there's reason for hope here. This is not our first rodeo. We have had tough times before, but out of them, and I mean the tough times that I just shared with you were about as problematic as they could get, grew some collaborations that have proven both enduring and effective. Now, indeed, they are under pressure now. We don't know what's going to happen with Russian participation on the International Space Station. But up to this point, something very productive for our country came out of what looked like just ashes and shambles. And so I think there's every reason, and I will argue this a little bit further as we get into the presentation for us to be hopeful about moving forward, rather than to be sorrowful about it or to give up. Next. Okay, let's talk about the space shuttle. A space shuttle is a different vehicle. It's a different beast altogether. Next, please. Reminder, the three pre-shuttle programs that I just shared with you, and Tim, if you would give me several clicks. Okay, single use, thank you. Single use hardware. Proof of capability was the name of the game for these early programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. The motivation was essentially political, although there was some good science that came out of it. The crews at that time, they were all test pilots and they were all men. Next, please. All Americans, except for the international collaboration that we enjoyed with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. They were launched to Cape Canaveral and they all had ocean landings. Okay, next slide, please. Space shuttle comes along. You look at these launch vehicles. First of all, it is a truly weird looking vehicle. It's the only one of the vehicles for which the payload is strapped to the side of the bomb. Think about that. Every other rocket that has ever flown, to my knowledge, has had the payload strapped to the top of the propellant tanks. And of course, the propulsive system, the business end of it, which are the exhaust nozzles, are at the bottom. So the payload's at the top, the propellant tank, which is the bomb, is at the center, and then the thrust vectoring is at the bottom through the nozzles. Space shuttle is very different. Next slide. Click. It's weird. It's a winged vehicle. It's a wing. Most spacecraft are not winged vehicles. It was a winged vehicle for two reasons. Next slide. It's a trans-atmospheric vehicle. It is both a spaceship and it's an airplane. Next. It was reusable hardware. Next. The purpose was to perfect working in space so we could become dexterous and do meaningful work, including the assembly of the International Space Station, which I'll share with you in a second. Next. Its motivation was primarily scientific and technical, although there is a national security role for the space shuttle, and a number of the missions were classified missions. The crews included scientists, engineers, physicians. Of course, there were pilots and people who could operate the machinery. The commander of the space shuttle and the pilot are both usually military qualified experts at aerodynamics and flight dynamics. And then next, the demographics, international. People from all over the world have flown on the space shuttle. And finally, next. Okay, the launch at Cape Canaveral, and then finally the landing, gliding to a runway at Cape Canaveral. And so this was a fully reusable spacecraft, actually not fully reusable. The external tank was not reused, but it was a largely reusable spacecraft that was designed for purposes that were completely different from, but an extrapolation of the purposes from the original three programs that I mentioned. The first of the three were really a proof of hardware. Could we maintain authority over these? And the space shuttle differed by being a vehicle that gave us a chance to visit space frequently, stay for relatively long periods of time, and get really proficient at doing meaningful things there. We're here to stay. Next slide. And one of the things it did, obviously, was create and dock with the International Space Station. And that's a significant set of things that it did, because it took a number of flights to build that space station, and that space station represents an international collaboration. Next. It's a large structure. And if you could give me some bullets here, Tim, a few facts and figures. It was built over a period of almost 14 years. Next. About 40 assembly flights. These are 40 flights out of the entire 135 flight manifest that belongs to, or that correlates with the space shuttle program. 40 of them were flights that were designed to assemble the International Space Station. It's about 1 million pounds in orbit, not quite. Next. It's about the size of a football field. So it's a big object. Next. And it has pressurized modules. And the pressurized modules are the silver-looking cylinders that you see there. Those long solar panels that you see that are in the plane of the picture are gathering energy and turning sunlight into electrical energy to power the spacecraft and power the things that are on the International Space Station. And there's some thin veins that you see coming out of the truss structure. And those veins basically are radiators. And so they're perpendicular generally to the plane of the solar panels because they're radiating or rejecting excess heat that builds up into the space in the International Space Station. They're rejecting that heat into space to keep the space station cool. You notice that 5 of those modules are Russian modules. And when the International Space Station was first constructed, the Russian Zarya module was the very first object placed into space. The second module was called the Unity module, and that was the module that the Americans took up with the Space Shuttle Endeavour. And when those two first joined, when they were first connected in space, that was the first formal, official, permanent collaboration of an international space venture among nations on Earth. Next. It's permanently inhabited and will remain so. Next. 250-mile altitude. Next. About 90 minutes to orbit Earth, which means it's seeing 16 sunrises and sunsets every day. And then finally, it's about a 51.6 degree inclination. Now, what that means is it's designed so that its orbital inclination, in other words, a 0 orbital inclination is if you're going around the equator at the 0 latitude. 90 degrees would be if you took that orbit, imagine it's like a record, like a thin record, and you rotated it 90 degrees, that would be a 90 degree orbit. So if you go between the 0 degree inclination and you go up to 51.6 degrees, that allows you to service the Russians so they can reach it, but it's higher than it actually needs to be for the Russians to reach it. It's a little higher so that there is no mistake on the part of the Chinese that we're overflying their territory. And so there's another political consideration in this effort. And the Chinese, by the way, are not a partner to the International Space Station. Next. This is a punchline here. There are 16 member nations associated with this vehicle that you're seeing on the screen, from Brazil all the way down to the United Kingdom. Again, Russia is a primary, Russian Federation is a primary player with 5 of the modules. Next, please. And I think an observation that I think merits putting out is that there is precedent. So in addition to being hopeful, because we have sort of let phoenixes rise out of the ashes before, you've seen the collaboration that we were able to have with the former Soviet Union, there's precedent for international collaboration. So all these countries are meaningfully involved in exploring space. And I think they're a model for broader cooperation, which I'd like to talk about in the next part of the talk. Next. Okay, so here's the deal. After all of this progress, the space shuttle retires, and this is the space shuttle fleet here. There were 5 space-worthy orbiters: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and then Endeavour. And you can see there, I'll let you read the number of flights that each had and the number of orbits. So the summary table that I'll show you next gives a view. It's a little hard to read, at least it is for me, so it probably is for you too. It gives you an overview of how these orbiters stacked up. There's a final column that shows cumulative missions, 135, as I'd indicated. The cumulative mission days was 1,300 days in space. That's a lot. Over 750 crew people actually flew on the space shuttle. Some flew multiple times. And there were over 21,000 orbits. If you were to stack all of the vehicular mileage for all of the 5 space shuttles together, it would extend you between here and Jupiter. That's how far out that cumulative mileage would have taken you. Next. All of the space shuttles are retired, so now we're relying on the Russian fleet to get us to space. And NASA makes a decision. And now I'm going to switch back to the Berger article. And this was his last set of concluding paragraphs, in which he's arguing the benefits of having private sector space exploration join that which was formerly government only. So you've got government agency model, which is the traditional model. And then the government looked, NASA looked around and they were looking at their budgets. NASA's budget had been $17 billion for almost forever. Then it went up to 19 billion. I think under President Trump, it went to 21 billion, but please don't hold me to that exact figure. But they've never been cash flush at NASA. They've never been, I don't think, even 0.4% of the national budget. They're very, very small in terms of their operating budget. So they realized maintaining the ability to go to low Earth orbit and doing deep space exploration were basically conflicting objectives. And so, next slide. What they did was shift by the creation of a private sector model, where now you have people providing launch services, and you're having people, when I say people, SpaceX, Blue Origin, places like that, that are creating their own astronaut crews to support those launch services. So now you have NASA petitioning them, which they just recently did again, to become more and more active in the solution of problems for space exploration. And thank you very much. We're going to move, next slide, please, all of the low Earth orbit over to the private sector model, or as much as we could. And that increases or shifts that cost, and then it lowers the cost to NASA. And so that was the incentive under the Obama administration, actually, to actually shift as much of NASA work as one could meaningfully shift into the private sector, so the private sector could do it more efficiently, they could do it more quickly in some cases, and of course they could relieve NASA of that burden. NASA is now entrusting the ability to get to space to the private sector. Next slide. And here's what happens. The profiteers come in, and some begin to nibble around the prospect of working with NASA, but it isn't sure, we're not really sure how well this is going to stick, because there could be losses associated with it. And if there's loss, and the losses accrue to a certain point, then the private sector is likely to back up. So NASA steps up to the plate and says, we'll be your contractor, or we'll be your client, I should say. And NASA began to seed the private sector's capability. And by seeding that capability, it's like priming a pump. They assure that the right people are in the right places at the right time with the right technical capability to carry this new burden forward. Next slide. And indeed, they did it quite well. Now, this is a slide that shows spaceports around the world. Some of them are still active, some are not. An active spaceport is one, or defined as one that has had at least one successful orbital capable launch within the last decade. Some of these have been declared inactive. You notice they pretty much spread kind of evenly around the globe. Only 3 places in the world, Russia, China, and America, have had the ability to launch humans into orbits from Earth. Next, please. And this shows the growth in commercial services. And the punchline from this is that if you look here, they're basically military, non-military, but non-military government, what we would call civil space exploration, and then commercial services. And you'll see that the military has declined substantially in terms of its ratio, also in terms of its number of satellites launched. And the number of satellites launched are what's on the right axis there. You notice that there was a spike 1997, 1998, in which the second space age, according to this, showed a rapid growth in commercial activity, which has tampered some. I haven't had the chance to update this slide to what's going on in 2021, but I dare say that the number of private sector launches has increased dramatically, so I would argue, so that if we were to extrapolate that beyond 2013 and come out to 2022 where we are, that fraction of, and this is consistent with Eric Berger's article, that fraction of commercial space activity has really skyrocketed relative to what we see as non-military government and military. Now, the thing to remember is that this is all launch services, and it is primarily low Earth orbit sort of things. Next. And so we're again focusing on Berger's, narrow, not inappropriate, but narrow look at human spaceflight and what it means to enter low Earth orbit. So we're defining spaceflight here very specific ways. Private spaceflight is spaceflight, or the development of new spaceflight technology, that's conducted and paid for by an entity other than the government agency, whereas space tourism is human, which is a subset of that, is human space travel for recreational purposes. Now, the difference between the two, as you may have surmised, is quite substantial, because The space tourism is largely targeted individuals who have the ability, the discretionary resources to choose to fly in space for recreational purposes. And so the target audience for that are people who are going to make up their minds individually about whether this is a safe thing to do. And so they're operating on a really tight margin. My belief is that they will have one chance only. If they make a mistake without having at least maybe several thousand successful flights under their belts, that industry is likely to collapse in on itself. It's just that vulnerable. Until they get a substantial number of flights, not unlike airlines, which are quite safe, they're really riding on the margin, as opposed to private space flight in the first definition, which is primarily paid for, even though it is not conducted by governmental authorities. They are primarily the consumers of those private sector capabilities. Next slide, please. A good example of that is shown here. You see, this is the collection of private space enterprises. Some are very interesting. Some carry people to low Earth orbit for recreational purposes, like Spaceship One. That's a scale of composites. Spaceship, that was the one that won the Ansari Prize for non-governmental agency first reaching space. Spaceship Two, that's a spaceship company. They've had amazing success. Sir Richard Branson has flown on that after having developed it over a period of about a decade and a half. The CST-100 is Boeing's entry into a lunar-bound ship. Dream Chaser is Sierra Nevada. Ariane, which is up the top left, is a French company that has a privatized version. They offer launch services, both orbital and suborbital. Launcher One, that's Virgin Galactic. They offer an orbital capability. They basically put their rocket, which is called Launcher One, under the bottom of the wing of a 747. They fly it to altitude, they build speed, they launch from there. And so they can reach orbital velocities using an aircraft as the first stage of the vehicle. You can think of it that way. And using their rocket, which is itself a two-stage, to actually, a single stage rather, which it can actually move an object at the speeds needed to reach a stable low Earth orbit, okay, which is about 18,000 miles an hour. Next slide. Here's the interesting thing. There's a new philosophy that's been introduced by all of this stuff, and it's the philosophy of efficiency and real cleverness. And I'm going to use SpaceX. I'm going to pick on them a little bit because they are, in my opinion, the organization that has demonstrated, I think, the most reliable set of consistently creative innovations in the launches that they've taken. This is a Dragon 2 spacecraft. Dragon 2 spacecraft is a human-capable spacecraft, so humans ride in this. The Dragon 1 was cargo only. And next slide. This is the space shuttle cockpit. This is a photograph of the space shuttle Endeavour, its interior, and you'll notice there are about 2,500 switches there, and there are about a dozen screens, and each one of them is a single-purpose set of switches and screens designed to conduct one particular task. You can see the rotational hand controller there. You might call it a joystick. That's the left seat. Forward-facing in any vehicle is the commander. The right seat is a pilot. And you'll notice that each of those switches there have toggles. Some of them are override switches. So they're designed so that the astronauts can cause something that needs to happen in case the computer systems fail. And so they're mechanical backups and redundancies that take a mechanical nature. If you turned around to the left, you would see what is called an aft-facing cockpit or an aft-facing flight deck. What you're looking at from this particular perspective, to the right actually, is the forward nose of a space shuttle vehicle. So if you were sitting there as commander or pilot, what you would see looking forward would be the bow of the vehicle and anything that is coming at you. If you turned around and looked backward, you would see the inside of the space shuttle's payload bay, through which you could monitor deployment and retrieval of spacecraft, satellites, and things like that if you needed to do that. So there are about 2,500 switches there. Next slide, please. This is a Dragon. It's basically 3 iPhones, giant iPhones, that are operating as an app, next slide, so that what you see on your screen is precisely what you need and nothing more. And so as new tasks and capabilities come up, the screens reflect for the astronauts what they need to do. It's a complete departure, a complete revolution in the thinking of how spacecraft could function. And you can well imagine what it does. It frees these humans, these clever, smart people who can think on their feet, from the operation of the vehicle itself. That's completely automated now. And now the people who are riding these vehicles are free to apply their own human creativity and their ingenuity and their ability to think faster on their feet to problem solving that does not have to do with the control and authority of the vehicle. So the control of vehicles moving forward is going to be increasingly automated. That's kind of like the Russians used to do it. And then the ability of astronauts on board those autonomously controlled vehicles is now going to free them to do things that are a lot more advanced in terms of creative thinking. That's going to have tremendous implications for the future. I'm going to say the somewhat distant future, when we're really, really deep space, going to places like the outer solar system and places that are bridges much too far at this point. Next, please. So I'm going to show you finally, I'm going to show you a little video here, and this is a SpaceX launch. And what you're going to see is the reuse of the boosters that push the SpaceX Dragons into orbit. This is a major innovation, and it involves recycling the first stage of rockets, which were normally thrown away in scrap. So you can see immediately that there would be a tremendous cost savings, and that's one of the things that Elon has done. Musk has realized that he can wring efficiencies out of virtually everything that one does involving spaceflight. So rather than trying to break the mold or create I should say, a highly efficient and advanced organization by knocking the ball out of the park every time, he's wringing efficiencies out of every aspect of spaceflight. And this is one particularly interesting one. So if we could have that, Tim. And what you're going to see is a launch. You're going to see the separation of the boosters, and you'll see them return. And I don't know whether that has a sound. If it doesn't, okay, I'll narrate it. So what's going to happen is this thing has left the launch pad. And as it goes up, you'll notice that what it's doing, do we have a audio there? Okay, so we're going downrange. One of the things that might be surprising to people is that mostly rockets go downrange if they're headed to low Earth orbit. They go a lot farther downrange than they go up, even though from our perspective on Earth, it looks like they go up and up and up forever. They don't. They really follow the curvature of the Earth so they can build orbital speed and orbit the Earth. And what's going to happen is this vehicle will continue its thrusting, and at a certain point, it's going to jettison those two side boosters that you see. And when it jettisons those boosters, you'll see a separation. That should be coming up right now. And when you see that separation, the boosters are going to flip. They'll reorient themselves. Starting now. Okay, so now you see three boosters going away, a central booster and two on the side. And what you're looking at is a series of cameras that are showing you the Earth. You can see the Earth limb there. Now, one of the things that makes this possible is there's the boosters are flipping. You can see in the upper image, it's going to flip so that its orientation allows it to do kind of like a Buck Rogers retro thrust. You'll see that. It's very impressive. And what allows this is the fact that these boosters don't have a re-entry problem. What I mean by that is this is taking place inside the atmosphere. It's not like we've gone out of the atmosphere, we've built tremendous speed, and we're trying to rush back in. So there's no frictional heating that these boosters have to survive. So there's no heat shielding or thing like that. Since they've not gone out of the atmosphere, now you can see them in the upper left. You'll see them return to the launch pad. The lower cameras show you the ground that's approaching, and there the boosters are. It's an amazing sight to see that. And until SpaceX basically solved the problems, this hadn't been done before. It's been talked about, but it hadn't been done before. So excellent examples, I think, of innovation and efficiency. Next slide, please. that's just a slide that shows them on the, they do ocean recoveries. They land these on barges. It's really amazing. It's like landing a needle on an aircraft carrier. It's kind of neat. Okay. Okay. Now, here's the thing. I think it's important for us to put human exploration in context, because it's the kind of exploration, again, people getting into rockets and going places that's most familiar to us. It's the thing that I guess the common person, I consider myself one of them, is most familiar with. It's something we can all relate to. We can intuit it. You get in a rocket, you want to go someplace, you launch yourself, you go there. I mean, it has an adventurous and kind of familiar feel to it. But it's only one part of what we're doing. So this slide here is an attempt to show you what human spaceflight actually is in context. So if you click, you'll see two green areas come up, I hope. Okay, now, if we look at robotic flight, we find out rather that robots have been able to explore our entire solar system, even out to Pluto. We've done that robotically. And the scale on the bottom actually shows the actual positioning to scale of the planets, but the planets themselves wouldn't be visible as that size in pixels said. So what I did, I increased the size of the planets just so you could see their relative mass on the top bar. Okay, now if you click again, you'll see a red circle come up, well, amber circle. That's where humans have explored so far. And if you click again, you'll see where we have if we go to Mars. Okay, so on the scheme of things, we haven't gone anywhere. The analogy would be you open the front door or the back door of your home, you step out on the back porch, and you see this tremendous vista in front of you. And then you take 3 steps down, you go into the yard, and you don't go any further. That's how far we've been. So when it comes to humans, it's the lion's share of space exploration that is visible to us, but we haven't gone anywhere. It's very, very difficult to keep humans alive in space because we die at the slightest provocation. It's a tough thing to do. It's not easy. And so even though human exploration is important and it's exciting and we can all relate to it, it's by no means all that is happening next. And so I'm going to conclude my talk here by trying to put a greater context to all of this conversation. And the context has to do with tools and destinations. And you're going to see 3 rows. One has to do with humans, which we've talked about. One is space probes, and the other happens to be telescopes. Now, the purple bars there show that basically there are only 2 ways to explore the universe. We either go to it or it comes to us, and that's how it works. If we go to it, we go as humans. And again, it's the Earth, Moon, the cislunar area that we have explored. Maybe we'll go to Mars one day, we'll see. Space probes give us the purview of our entire solar system. So we have planetary missions that have gone to every planet in our solar system, including Pluto. So that's inner solar system and outer solar system. And the little bar on the right shows the astronomers. And this is where the universe comes to us. And so you've got these 3 methods, primary methods of exploration. You've got these 4 destinations. And that's how they lay out. That's the context of space exploration, at least as I interpret it. Next, please. And so space probes, primarily all you're trying to do is get as close as you can. Next slide. And so data collection from space probes. This is an interesting slide because the sun is a star. Next, click please. But it doesn't look anything like a star. And so it's a very misleading thing. You never know it was a star unless you had done some research and just queried to figure that out, because it looks nothing like a star. Next slide. Nor does it look what it actually is, which is this roiling mass of energy, the result of nuclear fusion deep in its core, that causes these solar prominences to jet for millions of miles out into space. So from our perspective here on Earth, which is a central image, it's a beautiful sunset, the sun actually, as we experience, is nothing like what it actually is. And so we are visually limited in what we see. Next. You look at the Earth we have a lot of data for. We've got disaggregate data. We know its deserts, its rivers. We have data on its oceans. We have data on its pollution. We have data on forestation and deforestation. But the advantage of space exploration is, a click, please, is we can actually integrate all these things together. So we can aggregate these data and we can see how these individual collections of data have a global implication. And we can show where our planet is hot, where it's too cold, where it's not moist enough. We can show ocean rises, all of those things we can do by spacecraft that are orbiting the Earth. They don't leave our Earth, they orbit our Earth and they look back at us. Next slide. And so the inner and outer planets, well, inner planets, we have exogenous processes that we look at in the moons, and these are processes that are basically internal to the structure of the place that we, exogenous processes rather, are places that are forces that are external to the structure. So things like cratering things whack into a planet and they leave a big crater, or wind blows across the surface like Mars and it changes the surface, or there's erosion and there's evidence of erosion on Mars, which is very exciting because it implies that water had once flowed there. Next. And of course, there are endogenous forces like volcanism, cryovolcanism, meaning like super cryogenic volcanism from the center of a planet that bursts outwards. Tectonics, we're the only planet so far that has plate tectonics, but there are tectonics on other planets. And these cause shifts and cracks in the planet's surface. So we've got these exogenous and endogenous forces that help us understand inner planets and planetary moons. And next slide. We also have data from the outer planets that have primarily, since they're gas giants, and as far as we know, they don't have solid surfaces. And you can do another click on that if you would, Tim. We have the ability to look at magnetic fields, auroras, which are like the aurora borealis, and of course, storm systems. The one I've shown there, Neptune at the top, and then the famous storm, which is the giant red storm on Jupiter, which is at the bottom right. And so we have all this data collection that these robots do. And how do we get it? Next slide. We do it in a series of exploration stages. And there are 4 stages. We look from Earth, and this is an example of Mars. And then we fly by if we have the ability to do that. And this is Mariner 4's flyby. It basically transformed our understanding of Mars. Then we orbit, which is great because then we can observe the planet as the planet moves around the sun because we're traveling with it and we can see seasonal variations. And then finally we land if we can. Okay, and that's a photograph of a lander, one of the early Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. Next slide. Same thing for Saturn. We can look from Earth. Next. We can fly by. That's Voyager 2. Next. We can orbit. That was the Cassini spacecraft. And finally, this is not Saturn itself, but it's Titan, largest moon of Saturn. We sent a probe into Titan. And we found liquid hydrocarbon lakes there. It's really amazing. And then next, Pluto. Pluto is a flyby for all of human history. This image that you saw on the left is all we knew of Pluto. It was a number of pixelated image. We knew that it had a moon, Charon, which is shown there in the image. The flyby opened an entirely new world on that image. So the flyby of Pluto, that's called the heart of Pluto that you see. And, you know, this may actually, I hope you have the audio for this next narrative, Tim, because it's going to be really important. If you go next slide.
Just so you know, I can hear the audio on my end. I'm not sure if it's going out to the people that are watching at home,
right?
But I will go to the next one, and hopefully the audio will come through because I do have audio on my end.
Okay, yeah, I couldn't hear it on mine. Maybe
I'm sorry.
No, not a problem.
All right, let's see if someone at home can tell me if it's coming through. I'm going to start the video now for Mars 2020.
Okay, I cannot hear it. Well, I can narrate it. I don't.
Please do. You know.
Okay, that's okay. I'm going to take a chance to narrate. I hope I'm not talking over him. Okay, so here's the deal. Mars 2020 is a new rover. It's a new concept. And as Ken is arguing, what we're doing is we're taking everything that we knew from the prior Mars, which is the science laboratory, Mars Science Laboratory, and we've replicated as much as we could for that. So what we've done is we've gotten not a standard design, but we had a base design so that the innovations are not completely off the shelf, but they build on things that were off the shelf. And what we're doing is we've set up a system whereby we're going to do a sample return, and we're going to do it in 2 phases. The first thing we're going to do is land the Perseverance rover, which we did, and we're going to cache samples, meaning we're going to take samples, we're going to put them in a container, put them someplace safe. We designed a mechanism that allows us to cache them in a way that we can then go back for a future mission. And when we go back, we'll pick up that cache, we'll bring it back to Earth, and that way we'll accomplish a sample return in 2 separate phases. So what this narrative is showing you now is that if you knew where to look up at JPL, you could see the basic architecture of this new rover, the Mars 2020 rover, having been built upon experiences that we had from the Mars Science Laboratory. And those experiences include, for example, how we get down safely to the Martian surface. So one of the things that we can do is we can map as we're coming down, like a terrain comparison map, so that as this thing flies across the surface, it can divert from obstacles if it needs to. And so it can land in places that are much more tightly controlled or tightly defined, so we can get to the places that we need to get to a lot more quickly, and we can be more precise in our landing. And there are 3 places that we're going to be picking landing sites, and those are places from which we're going to cache samples. So this is a rover, and as it lands, it can cache samples in each of the several areas that it does, because it does have the ability to scoot around on Mars. This is a design of the caching system, and you'll see through this is a great animation. I love this animation. You'll be able to see how the caching system is designed to drill the rock cores and then take the rock core samples, put them into the test tubes, get the test tubes designed and aligned so that they are now in a complete package. It's just like a kit. And that package is then the target of the future exploration or the return rover, the return part of the sample return mission. That will then take place probably in the next, I'm going to say, 5 to 7 years. So this is an unbelievable opportunity to actually bring large chunks of a very distant place back to Earth. And it will be a new capability entirely if we're able to do that. So another observation, that the opportunities for international cooperation, they really need to go far beyond our thinking that involves only human spaceflight exploration. So right now, our collaborative efforts are primarily in terms of human exploration, not exclusively, but primarily. And I'm arguing that we should think very carefully about broadening these in every aspect that we can. And I'm going to conclude by looking at next slide. Telescopes. Next, please. So there are several epochs in astronomy, and there are 5 as I kind of think of it. There's time, that is to say, when do you plant and when do you harvest and when do you worship? And there is order, and that's a question of how do the heavens move? Is there a method to the madness? Can we predict it? Can we know where planets are going to be and what time and so forth? And then there's a question of scale. How big is the universe? Composition. What is it made of? And then finally, evolution. How has it changed since it first began? And if you give me a click, Tim, there's several periods, which I call the ancient astronomy period from about the 1st century to 1500. The age of measures, which were largely devoid of telescopes, but they had to do with measuring the precise angles of things in the night sky. Pre-modern astronomy, which became particularly relevant in 1923 when we realized that the universe was expanding, and also relevant, believe it or not, we didn't realize that there were other galaxies that existed until 1923 when Edwin Hubble proved that with his observations up at the Mount Wilson Observatory here in Southern California. And when you think about that, that's kind of crazy. It's not been for 100 years that we knew that there were other galaxies, but that's true. And then finally, an age of modern astronomy, which I'm going to argue is propelling us into an entire new opportunity for our thinking. Next. So telescopes, they do 2 things. They make larger things that you can already see, but they also let you see stuff you didn't know was there. And the little inset image that you see in green was when I was up at the observatory, Griffith Observatory, and I was looking through the 100-inch telescope, and they had taken the charge coupled devices off, and they let me put my camera, my little iPhone 6 camera, which I still have, and I clipped that picture, took that picture of Venus. I'm not Venus, of Jupiter in broad daylight. Absolutely invisible to the eye. Could not see it. But that telescope has a collecting aperture power. It's a 100-inch telescope that allows you to see things that you didn't know where. And if you look very carefully, you can even see the atmospheric striations on Jupiter. You can see the 3 bands there. So telescopes are powerful instruments, and I'm going to go through some very quickly. Next. Beginning with the Daniel K. Inouye telescope. This is daytime astronomy looking at the sun. Next. We have the ability to study sunspots in extraordinarily detail. As you know, sunspots are cool places on the sun, and they follow a sunspot cycle of about every 11 years. Next. Solar irradiance. What's happening on the surface of the sun, and how does the magnetic field structure of the sun influence prominences and things that you see? This is a solar dynamics observatory. Next slide. And you can see what these prominences do. I mean, these things fly millions of miles in space, and they're magnetically field determined, or at least correlated. And the question is, how is our star behaving? It's a really important star to get to know. If there's one star in the universe that we should probably understand a little bit about, it's this one. Okay, next. We're looking at nighttime observatory. These are the Keck observatories. Those giant domes have the ability to correct for aberrations and motion of the atmosphere. Next. So it's almost as though they're outside the atmosphere, not quite. And there is an infrared version of Neptune. You can see the bands there, their thermal differences. These are entire clusters of galaxies that are colliding. And the haze that you see there is the implication of where dark matter might be and how they're controlling the collision of the galaxies, or influencing them, I should say. Next, please. The Hubble Space Telescope, which is arguably, I think, the most familiar of all the telescopes that we've launched. If somebody is going to know what a telescope looks like and they happen not to be involved in this area, it's the Hubble. At least that's one that you would have heard of. And the Hubble images are simply spectacular. Next. These are pillars of creation. This is the optical version. This is what you would see with your unaided eye. If I go to the infrared version, next, you can actually see what the thermal composition is, and you can see that these are incubators for baby stars. That's where baby stars are born. And they'll get their lights going, and eventually they will clear out that dust and have their own solar systems in a process that takes billions of years to occur. But that's the way we think it works. Next. This is a comparison of those 2 images that I mentioned. Next. This is the Horsehead Nebula, and I want you to notice the 3-dimensionality of that. This is an unprecedented clarity for an object like the Hubble telescope, which is outside the atmosphere and able to peer deeply into the recesses of our universe. Next. The Chandra Space Telescope, very odd-looking telescope. It's an X-ray telescope. Next. It shows thermal signatures that are extraordinarily hot. To the left, that's Chandra. To the right, that's the Deep Space Survey. Those are optical, and they are of the same image. Next. The Spitzer telescope, that's infrared. That measures temperatures that are very low, relatively low. And this is composite telescope imagery that combines the Chandra telescope, the Hubble telescope, and the Spitzer telescope with 2 galaxies that happen to be colliding. Over millions and billions of years, these collisions take place. And you can see that the gravitational influence of the 2 galaxies on each other is causing them to distort, both spiral galaxies, and now they're beginning to have this confluence. And there are simulations that will run forward and backward to tell you how these things might settle out in the millions of years that it takes for them to do their collision. Next. Radio telescopes, extremely long wavelength. This is next. Abilities to take, this is the same object as M31. It's the Andromeda Galaxy. It's the closest galaxy, major spiral galaxy to us, about 2.5 million light years away. And you can see what that one object looks like in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, from radio all the way to X-ray. So it's the same object, but that object is now sort of sliced, if you will, according to that part of the temperature spectrum or the electromagnetic spectrum that you're most interested in understanding. And each field of astronomy has its own set of questions and its own rationale for wanting more and more power, more and more resolution for each of these areas that we're looking at here. Next. And of course, the James Webb Telescope, unbelievably impressive technology to get that thing. It's about 1 million miles from Earth right now, 4 times the distance of the moon. And that will, next slide, give us a look back to about the first 200 million years after the Big Bang, when the stars and the galaxies first began to form their structures. So this is the time machine of time machines. It's going to let us look all the way back, almost to the point of the Big Bang, not quite, but about 200 million years or so after that happened. And the Big Bang not only is a point of interest to the James Webb Telescope, but because it's designed with an infrared sensor primarily, both near infrared and long infrared, the James Webb Telescope is going to be a good planet detector, because planets, excuse me, that are orbiting, exoplanets rather, that are orbiting their stars are very difficult to detect directly. And so this will be an opportunity for us to learn more about exoplanets than we've ever learned before. And the latest thing called the Decadal Survey, which is, as the name implies, something we do every 10 years, where the international scientific community makes recommendations about what we should be spending our resources on, is focusing on the detection of Earth-like exoplanets. There are other things that are in the Decadal Survey as well, but this is one of the things that is a key objective of our scientific community. So we're going to see if there are other Earths in the universe, and it's just in a very, very exciting time. Next. Observation. Our telescopes have revealed a universe that the ancestors couldn't see, and they're also teaching us about the starlight, that it reveals speed, it can tell the direction, the temperature, and the composition of things that we observe. So we're able to get a handle on the structure of our galaxy and the structure of our universe that we could never do before. Next, please. Scale. How big is the universe? Next. So if I take the sun and I reduce it to a 4-inch diameter, okay, and now I go to not Manitowoc, but Manitowoc. Manitowoc? Manitowoc. Thank you, Manitowoc. There you go. I'm going to get it right. Okay, and I'm going to place it right there at the Manitowoc Public Library. Okay, now I'm going to lay the solar system out so that the entire solar system goes from the Manitowoc Public Library just past the Advantage Driving School that you see there on the map. Okay, now I'm going to take that solar system, and the solar system is arranged pretty much according to where the planets would space themselves out. There's the sun at the center and the 4 inner planets, and then there are the planets that are the outer gas giants. And I even included Pluto there to the left of the Advantage Driving School because I like Pluto. Okay, so next slide. That ring is the solar radius, now the solar diameter. The whole thing could fit right in Manitowoc as you see it if the sun were only 4-inch in diameter. So if you had a 4-inch diameter sun, that is the purview of our solar system, or the range of our solar system, right there in that beautiful little community. Okay, you can see how much room it would take. Now, next slide. Now I'm going to zoom out, and you see where the red hour is. Well, that's where Manitowoc is. It's just on the eastern edge of central Wisconsin there. Eastern edge of Wisconsin, rather, in like halfway north and south of the state. Okay, now I'm going to put a ring around that, and that ring shows the location of the nearest star. So if the entire solar system could fit within a few blocks, actually it's about 20 blocks in Manitowoc, then the closest star would be anywhere on that ring. That's the Alpha Centauri ring. In other words, it's a 4 light year perimeter around that circle. So it gives you a feeling for how far things are away. That's 8,000 solar system radii. So the closest star to Manitowoc, which is the center of the universe, obviously, is 8,000 solar system diameters away, 8,000. And it took us 9 years to get to Pluto with our current speeds. So that'd be 72,000 years, roughly, if we'd have tried to travel to Pluto. So next slide. So we have a local group of stars. It's 25 light years across. The sun is at the center of this, and the closest star is Proxima Centauri. Next slide. We are part of a Milky Way. So that local group of stars is only one tiny group that is in a Milky Way that is 100,000 light years across. And if you give me a click, you'll see where our sun is. And we're orbiting that sun. And of course, the sun wouldn't nearly be that large. It would be a dot. You wouldn't even see it. I had to enlarge it just so you could see its position. Next slide. Our place in the local group. So you'll see the Milky Way galaxy is joined by about 100 others. Actually, about 3 of those are major galaxies. One is called Andromeda. You can see that to the right. That's the bright one. That's M31, 2.5 million light years away. And there's a one called Triangulum, which is down to the lower left of Andromeda. Those are the 3 major galaxies in that local group. Next. And that local group is a little teeny cluster. That red dot is so much larger than it has to be. I mean, you wouldn't even see that group. In something called the Laniakea, which means immeasurable heaven. And so that's the supercluster that we're a part of. And then next slide. This is a rendering of what our universe looks like. It's a series of threads that are connecting galaxies that are in constant motion. It's this giant cosmic dance. And that series of threads is punctuated by enormous voids, and it would be impossible, because this is essentially an infinite entity, to tell you where the Earth would be in that. And so if one were to spin you around in, let's say, 360 degrees and let you go, you wouldn't know where you're going to be. No, that's okay. Next slide. That's great. So our universe, I think, has proven itself discoverable. That's pretty amazing, by leaving clues. And these clues let us create instruments that take us beyond our human senses. And so all of this is leading up to something that I think is very important. Next. If we look at evolution and composition, how has the universe changed since it began, and what is it made of? Next. This lady here is Dr. Vera Rubin, and she worked with Carnegie Institute for many years. And she's the one who discovered dark energy by looking at galaxy rotation rates. And if you give me a click, those things should rotate. And she noted that the predicted rate of rotation, which should follow Newton's laws, in other words, things that are closer to their gravitational center would move faster than things far away. You'll see to the right, which is what she observed, that the galaxies are spinning far more quickly than they should. They should be flying apart, and yet they are not. And this is consistent across virtually all galactic measures. And it implies the existence of something called a dark matter, which we cannot see. We don't know what it is. And it's holding our universe together. At least it's holding galactic structures together. But that's a dark energy. I'm sorry, a dark matter. Conflict or compare that with dark energy. Next slide. And you realize that there's this force in the universe. No one knows what it is. That is causing the universe itself to expand increasingly with time. Now, why does this make sense? No one knows. Dark matter is clustering together things that should otherwise fly apart on a local level, but on a universal scale, dark energy is causing the universe itself to expand, and that expansion is increasing over time, and there is a relationship between the speed with which something is moving away from us and its distance, so that farther objects are moving away, racing away from us much more quickly than lower objects or closer objects. And so next, we have this conundrum in the sense that 4% of everything in the universe is amenable to our telescopes, whether or not we can optically see it or not. So we can optically see a tiny slice of that 4% because our eyes have evolved to see certain colors. But outside that range, we have X-ray on the high and we've got radio waves on the low that we can't see. But our telescopes can measure those things, as I just showed you. But that's 4% of everything. Roughly, these numbers have jumped around over time, but roughly 22% of everything is that dark matter. and 74% is dark energy. So the punchline is we don't see very much of the universe at all. In fact, we know virtually nothing about it. Next slide. Conclusion. We've got the technology now to meaningfully address this question of the origin of the universe and our purpose and role in it. We didn't have that before. We could have conjecture about it, we can speculate about it, we can talk metaphysically about it, but now we are on the cusp of being able to actually measure with amazing precision things that will allow us to answer those questions, or at least meaningfully address them. Next. So I want to conclude this with a series of observations. The observations are, I'm going to go back to these and summarize the observations that I mentioned before, just to pull them all in one place. And there are about 6 of them, half a dozen of them. First of all, I think we have reasons for being hopeful. We've had tough times before, but some very meaningful, enduring collaborations have come out of them. And I think we need to be hopeful that we can return to those days. There is a precedent for international collaboration, at least on the International Space Station and otherwise as well. So that's a model for broader cooperation. There are opportunities for international cooperation, and I think they go far beyond projects involving just human spaceflight. I think our telescopes, this is a revelational thing, have shown us a universe that our ancestors could not have imagined, and they've given us the tools so that we can measure speeds and directions and temperatures and compositions of things that we can't possibly reach. Arguably, we're in the worst possible spot because we're attached to our planet here. We have an invitation, I think, which is issued by our universe, if I can think of it anthropomorphically like that. Universe has given us an invitation to have a conversation with itself. It's proven itself discoverable by leaving clues and hints that let us create instruments that take us beyond our human senses. In other words, right here on Earth is the source of the materials that we use to fabricate our telescopes and our spectroscopes and all the universe and all of the things that we use to explore the universe. So it's almost as though the universe has seeded itself with the answers to its own origins, at least here on planet Earth, and presumably many, many other places as well. And finally, in terms of scope, we've got the technology to meaningfully address this question about the origin of the universe itself and to sort of really think carefully and critically about our purpose and our role in the universe as human beings. So I'm going to conclude with some policy considerations. These are not suggestions, and if I could have a click, these should all appear at once, I hope. Thanks, Tim. I think we have an obligation, and that's to broaden the questions that we ask as an international community. And we need to address our origins and define our purpose. I think we should put more emphasis on those questions. I think it makes sense to have a certain humility and to understand a certain place. We should recognize, based upon our findings, the fragility of the Earth and take steps to protect it. And that's the fragility not only because of climate change that's happening, but because of the fact that this is an orb that is orbiting a star that has a finite lifetime. It's a long lifetime, but it's not forever. And that is subject to impacts and all manner of perturbances just because of its position and its vulnerability in the universe. Something out there, some large rock has our address on it, and it's just a matter of time before it visits us. Persistence. I think we have to ensure that the international community of science has managed to continue its work without interruption under all circumstances. And that implies a flexibility that we should be capable of quickly passing the ball or the torch, as it were, to people who can carry on during times when others cannot, and there are others who cannot right now. And then finally, we should be open, I believe, to re-engage those with whom we have had adversarial relationships, but under conditions that best serve our efforts to explore and that respect our collective security. So I'm going to end my talk right there. I thank you so much for your attention. And again, thank you, Tim, and the Foreign Policy Association for letting me be involved with this. It's a great honor. I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I am happy to take any questions.
Now, I'm going to reintroduce myself into the picture on a small scale. Now, we do have several questions and comments. Obviously, outer space is a vast
Oh,
area,
yeah.
and we've gone almost the full length of the 2 hours that we have for the lecture, which was phenomenal. I am not complaining in any way, shape, or form. Do you mind going a little past the 2 hours?
I'm happy to, absolutely.
Okay. So if anyone who's following around, we have some really good questions. If you're following along, one advantage to doing this virtually is the only person they have to kick out of the library is me. And as long as they're still vacuuming the floors, they're not going to be able to pry me out of this lecture. So my first question, and this has everything to do with the fact that we couldn't hear the audio on those two clips. Would you be amenable to people who are following along who would like a copy of your PowerPoint? Is it okay if I pass that along to them?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So if anyone following along would like to get the PowerPoint, I'm not sure why this is scrolling, but just email me at the library, tgodzinski@manitowoc.org, and I would be more than happy to supply you with the PowerPoint where you'll be able to hear the audio, because I definitely was able to hear the audio. So just contact me and we'll get that to you. So let's get to some of the questions and comments that were going on. One of the first things we received was from Nancy, who said, absolutely wonderful speaker with a gift for making it understandable to us non-scientists. I couldn't agree more. It was just 2 hours cram-packed with information that was just incredible. So thank you so much for the lecture. Now, here come the questions.
Okay.
What are the military implications of space travel?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure what you mean by the question. If you mean, okay, if you're talking about the capability to leave the Earth for substantial distances, the military implications might be nil, because you would almost have to fabricate a reason for a conflict to take place if you're substantially far into the solar system. If you're talking about close to home and you're looking at low Earth orbit capability, you could, and this has been done before, this is not new. If you remember the Star Wars under President Reagan, that was an effort to look at space as a place that one could put defensive missile systems to prevent a launch, preempt one if possible. If that launch took place and you didn't preempt it, then at least you could intercept it. If you didn't intercept it in space, then maybe you could look from the ground and see if you could intercept an incoming hostile object as it penetrated its way through the atmosphere. And there are all kinds of technical reasons, or ways, I should say, for kind of sorting that out. So the implications depend, I think, on where you're going. Space flight is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And I mean, if I were thinking from a military perspective, and I have had at least limited opportunity to do that, I would put my money elsewhere, quite frankly. And that doesn't mean that I'm publicly saying that I don't respect the U.S. Space Force that President Trump created when he was in office. It may have its place, but I don't understand the utility of it, given what I understand to be the difficulty of space exploration, with one exception. If it's a way to get a better handle on controlling electromagnetic signals and preventing people from jamming or otherwise blocking important communications, it might be useful to have something positioned in space that does that. But if you're talking about something that has to do with the shooting of bullets to claim territory, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, the Chinese and the United States are both very interested in going back to the moon. We're going as a return trip. The Chinese will be doing their first visits to the moon. They've been very aggressive and looking at the dark side of the moon, that is to say, the side that doesn't face the Earth, more so than we have. It could be that someone would come up with a rationale for us to have a fight over territory on the moon. To me, That doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. And so space travel could have military implications depending on whether you land on a territory, you fill in the blanks. It could be Mars, it could be the moon, or whether you don't. And I hope that long-winded answer to a very direct and good question made sense.
Yeah, definitely. And this next question kind of leads right out of what you were talking about. And space exploration is really cool, but is there no longer any strategic or military value to outer space? If not, good. But if yes, please tell me why you should feel not fearful about having all this controlled by the private sector. What is to prevent the owners of these enterprises from having undue influence and or control over any such conflict, either in terms of conflict resolution or incitement? Now, from what you just said, the difficulty of space travel plays into that a lot. But do you see any issues with it being more in the hands of the private sector now?
It's always been in the hands of the private sector in that every military system that we've developed, even though it's been contracted by the Pentagon or chairman of the Joint Chiefs or whatever, those have all been under U.S. contractor sponsorship. In other words, we would go to a Lockheed or to a Boeing or to a Northrop Grumman, and we would put out specifications for a Joint Strike Fighter or for some kind of a space-based observation system. We do a lot of that. Military surveillance. Those have always been the purview of the contractors that design and build those things under the direction of our government. Now, unless there is a change and our civilian entities are no longer in charge of policy decisions like whether we go to war or whether we don't, I don't think you have to worry about this unless there is a change. Now, if it gets to the point that the contractors themselves, as opposed to the government, are directing what happens with weapon systems that are built and whether or not those weapon systems are built, that's problematic. But I would say that would be a sea change in the way we think of ourselves as a democracy, with independent actors taking it upon themselves to decide what has traditionally been national policy objectives and national policy direction. And remember, it doesn't seem like it at the case at sometimes, but at least in our case, in our democracy, civilians basically call the shot. They call the policy, the direction. They call and cause the policy directions that we take, whether we like it or not. And those who serve those civilian policy directives are those who are our armed forces. Okay, Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force. And so those Joint Chiefs of Staff and those generals, as senior as they are reporting to a civilian, that is to say, an elected leadership. And so this is a great question. I think it's problematic only if there is a real threat to our democracy. There is a threat to our democracy, but only if that threat flips and we become basically a vigilante kind of a society, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Mark, who asked the first question, also wanted to say it was a fantastic presentation and he would have paid to see it. So that's the first time I've ever heard that comment. So well done and thank you. And then Jackie added, I agree. The images are incredible. They're so much better than what we studied in an astronomy class 40 years ago. But how will this collaboration on the International Space Station work now that the U.S. is no longer liking the Russians?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think we are independently capable of getting to and from the space station right now, which was great. I mean, SpaceX was, we put our eggs in one basket when NASA decided, when NASA said, look, we can't do both low Earth access to orbit and the exploration that we want to do as a chartered entity. And they shifted that to the private sector. That was a risk. And if the private sector had dropped the ball on that and we didn't have access to the International Space Station, then we'd really be up the creek. But we are independent of Russian participation on the International Space Station right now. And we've also extended, I think the station is going to orbit now until 2030, I think. I can't remember. It's going to be, they have extended the projected lifetime of the International Space Station by a considerable period of time. And so it could be that this goes one of two ways. either things settle down and there is a leadership or regime change in the former Soviet Union in Russia, and we get back on better terms with them, which is a possibility, or they are no longer a participant in the International Space Station, and as long as they don't do anything to physically target it, in other words, they don't shoot it down, they don't explode debris in its path, as long as they don't do something like that, I don't think it has much, I don't see that being a big ripple in the pond. I could be wrong about that, but it seems like with some foresight and a lot of luck, we're in a position where we are not held hostage, at least as far as that particular orbiting asset is concerned.
Mark had an additional question, which is, what is the oversight of space travel? And will we as a country ever send a person to the moon again?
Yes, we will. In fact, the Artemis mission, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, there's just so much. I didn't know what I was going to talk about. Anyway, the Artemis mission is a mission that's designed to fly the first woman, and the first woman, I think the first person of color. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, people to the moon, and they were originally scheduling a 2024 landing for that, but that isn't going to happen now. The Space Launch System is the muscle, the big rocketry that's going to get us there, and the Artemis system. Artemis was the sister of Apollo, and so the Artemis, hence the woman, the female connection there. And Artemis is supposed to be a return to the moon that will stick. So the first time we went to moon, it was to beat the Russians. And then once that happened, we were kind of looking around and said, okay, well, we beat them. Now what do we do? Well, we didn't have a national concerted exploration policy for staying there. In fact, we didn't send the first geologist to the moon until Apollo 17. That was Harrison Schmitt. And you would think if you're going to the moon, you're going to send a geologist, but you had all these successful landings, and somebody probably, let's get a geologist on the moon. And Harrison's available, we'll send him. But now we're going to go back, I think, with a more meaningful directive. And so we're going to stay. We're going to learn to use the moon as a base of, quote, independent operations that will teach us how we should behave, how we can function efficiently when we go to Mars, which is 100 times more difficult. It's 100 times farther. Okay, really, really tough. So the moon is a good practice space for that. And so it's liable to stick and last the congressional changes that take place and always mess up the funding, because one administration comes in and they like a project, another administration comes in and they don't like it. So these things are on and off and on and off the table again. But I think this one has the chance to stick because it's serving as a training ground for this human step to Mars. So yes, short answer, yeah, we're definitely going to the moon. It's a really big deal.
Next question is, Barb wanted to know, when humans return to Earth after extended periods in space, what are some of the things they have difficulty adjusting to again?
Yeah, that's really a good question. In fact, if you read Scott Kelly's book about his year in space, he had all kinds of physiological things. First of all, he actually, Scott Kelly and Mark Kelly are twins. They're both astronauts. Mark Kelly is now a senator in Arizona. He's running again for his reelection. And he's a multi-time commander of the space shuttle. And his twin brother, Scott, went into space. And they were, you always want to study twins if you can. Smart family, by the way. Anyway, so Scott goes to space. He stays for a year. They're both twins. Scott comes back, and he's about 3 inches taller than Mark, because he doesn't have the gravitational compression on his spine. Now that basically returned, and as it returned, it was not without its problems. The other thing, which is kind of humorous, is when you're in space, your orientation and your perception changes. So that when you come back to Earth, for example, they tell someone who has recently returned to space, they tell their spouse, don't ever hand them the baby. Because you're so used to things floating in space, you'll just let it go. Because that's what you've been, because your computers float, your notepads float, your stuff like that. Everything is floating in space. And in order to make it not float, you've got to Velcro strap it down. So you come back with this expectation, and your behavior has to be unlearned when you return. And there are also physiological differences. For example, when you're in space, things like the muscles of the heart They do a little bit of a decompress, and you don't have as much in terms of muscle structure. The bone structure, which is particularly problematic because you lose. What happens when you're in space is your bone reconstruction goes down and your bone degradation goes up. So it's a double whammy. And one of the ways that you lose calcium, we think, is that you urinate more in space. And you urinate more because you're in a lower pressure environment. Your body puffs up. It says, oh, I'm fluid rich. I got to get rid of it. And so it's this homeostatic series of events that takes place. The body's doing its best it can to return itself to a healthy status, but it's making mistakes because it didn't evolve in that condition. So when you're coming back on Earth, muscles have to be rebuilt. That includes the heart. Bone structure has to be replanted if you can do it. Psychological, not disturbances, but psychological expectations and the ability to behave normally in a gravity environment have to be learned again. You have to be able to learn to walk down a hallway, stop, make a sharp left turn, which you can't do when you come back from space because you're used to floating very gracefully around. So there's a lot of stuff. And one final thing is I understand that it's a one-for-one relationship. So if you're in space for a year, it takes you about a year to recover your entire earthbound capabilities. If you're in space for a month, it takes about a month. And we've never been longer than a year. So if you were there for 5 years, I don't know what it would take. So there's lots of stuff.
Yeah.
I
think we're winding down a little bit in the audience participation part. I could be wrong, but a couple more comments was that Nancy said she watched this on her large screen TV and it was a great experience. She's going to watch it again and send the link to her grandsons with that recommendation that they watch it on as big a screen as possible.
That's very kind.
With the pictures, I certainly agree. And a really good comment to end it on is just this one by Virginia. Fascinating. And I think that sums it up in 4 short syllables excellently. And on that note, I think we're going to end it for the evening.
Thank you, Tim.
Absolutely
fantastic
lecture.
I'm sorry I talked and yacked on so much. You should have poked me through my computer and said, hey, come on.
No such thing. No reason to do that because, I mean, you covered so much ground is the wrong word for it, but you covered so much territory and all of it was, as someone said earlier, really complex concepts and thoughts. You explained it so wonderfully. And I think everyone who followed along definitely would agree with that. It was a great way to end the series this year. And thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you.
And thank you again to our audience this evening that, people really did stick with it. People were not, just running away, and everyone found it fascinating. That's why I thought it was an ideal way to end it on. And so on behalf of Manitowoc Public Library, all of our sponsors, and I'm sorry, I will go back to this one comment that just came in from Penny, who says, we'd rather have the presentation than our questions. And in a perfect world, we would strike a balance. I am really thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for sticking around and going past the 2 hours. It was such a good presentation. I certainly didn't want it to end without people being able to interact with you a little bit. And I'm very thankful that we made the pivot towards doing some virtual programming, because we never would have had this lecture if we hadn't made that pivot. And so I'm so glad to have you. Everyone who attended tonight, thank you so much. And thank you for attending this entire year. It's been 8 absolutely fascinating and wonderful lectures. And I would definitely encourage anyone who would like any of the PowerPoints to contact me at tgadzinski@manitowoc.org. But for Manitowoc Public Library, And everyone who was involved this year with great decisions, thank you so much for coming tonight, and to any of our other presentations. Have a wonderful night. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for being here.
My pleasure. Take care.
Take care. Have a great night, everyone.